Thank you, Jay, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining this latest edition of the Gateway Rural Health Lecture Series. My name is Dan Stringer, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Gateway Center of Excellence in Rural Health, and I'll be your moderator today. Gateway is located in Goderich, Ontario, and to the best of our knowledge is the only community-driven rural health research institute in Canada. Our mission is to improve the health and quality of life of rural residents through research, education, and communication. Gateway launched this virtual lecture series in February of this year, with social isolation being top of mind as COVID-19 restrictions were tightening. Seemed an ideal time to launch this initiative. Through these lecture series, we hope to contribute to rural health knowledge and innovation while virtually connecting communities and helping to reduce social isolation. For those of you with perfect attendance in this second semester of the Gateway Lecture Series, that's from September to December, we will send you out a diploma recognizing your commitment to and involvement with this educational series. I'm pleased to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Heather Mair. Heather is an associate professor in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies at the University of Waterloo. Heather's also a research chair at Gateway, and as chair of the Rural Community Development and Well-Being, she has been actively involved in a number of research projects and surveys at Gateway, and we appreciate her wisdom and the effort and commitment she makes to Gateway. So thank you for joining us today, Heather, and before I pass it over to you, I'll quickly introduce your panel members. And with us today, our panelist, Jay McFarlan, board member and Gateway Research Chair of Rural Nutrition and Exercise. Chris Lee, former board member at Gateway and currently an advisory board member at Gateway. He's deeply involved with the G2G Rail Trail and is on the Trail Advisory Committee liaison. And we welcome Dr. Karla Boluk, Associate Professor in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies at the University of Waterloo. I want to thank all of you for participating in today's discussion. And Heather's topic today is, quote, taking leisure seriously for well-being. So now I'll hand it off to you, Heather, and let you take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dan. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see that? All set? You can just see the screen, not my top secret notes. Good. All right. So I'll begin today by stating that I'm coming to you from Guelph, and that's the ancestral land of the Attawandaron people, the treaty land and the territory of the Mississaugas and the Credit. So I'd like actually to give you a little work assignment while we talk about leisure. And if you could take a minute or so, I'll give you about 30 seconds or so to write down, think about, or type into your phone 3 things that you'd love to do, that you would describe as your leisure. Try to identify a few of the qualities of those activities. What is it like in those activities? What is it about them that you love? And what do these activities say about you? So I'll give you 30 seconds or so to think about or jot down 3 activities that you would describe as your leisure. And then we'll hopefully circle back to those in the discussion or perhaps at the end of this conversation. Okay. So you might imagine, and perhaps this was a feeling that you had when you saw the title of the lecture, for one who studies leisure, we are confronted with a lot of eye rolling, some snickers, some snide remarks about the work that we do. And so I'm always kind of interested in trying to push people's thinking about leisure and to think about it more seriously and to think about the ways that it can be thought of as a much more meaningful part of human existence. So that's my goal today, is to help kind of counter those smirks and snickers that we might get when you hear that someone is a leisure scholar. So that's my goal today. And I want to start by showing you some of the ways that people in my field talk about leisure and study it and consider it. So here are some ways to think about leisure. It's more than just free time. It can be a state of mind, a sense of freedom and self-determination, a source of identity, a tool for managing stress and fatigue. And on that note, there was a study recently from Statistics Canada that said as of 2020, the average adult spends 39.9 hours working per week, and 47% of Canadians, the workplace is their primary cause of stress. In an environment where we spend a great deal of our time working, it becomes especially important to start prioritizing our health. We've learned that it only takes half an hour of exercise a day to reduce anxiety by 48% and depression by 47%. It's also known to be the #1 treatment of fatigue. Leisure can also be a source of meaning. It can be a way of thinking about the relationship between individuals and their community. It can be a non-material need. I think we need more of those these days. It can also be a manifestation of inequality. And a lot of leisure scholars are asking who has access to the leisure that they need in their life and who doesn't and why. It can be a conduit for healthy aging. It can be a counter to the dominance of this idea of work. When someone asks you what you do, what do you tell them? Do you describe your paid employment? How do you describe yourself? I think it can be a path towards reconciliation. We think about the spaces and the places where our leisure takes place in this country, and a lot of them are places that have been taken. They're ancestral lands, they're lands that we're rethinking in terms of settler colonialism. So it can be a path towards reconciliation. And I think ideally, it's a window into our world. These are two of my favorite quotations about leisure, and I always use them in my classes with my students. The first is by Aristotle, who talked about leisure as the goal of all human behavior, the end towards which all action is directed. Everything leads to leisure. Leisure isn't a side project. It's not something that you do at the end of your day and when your job is finished. It is the goal of human behavior. It's a beautiful way of thinking about it. My other favorite way of thinking about it is by a British sociologist, Chris Rojek, who talks about leisure as where we confront our chained existence with the greatest candor. So imagine having that space to think about your life and how you want to change it and be active and self-determinant in your life. Leisure can be the place where you enact those things. And of course, leisure is a human right. Everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. That's the Article 24 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I have a bit of a bone to pick with this article because I think it juxtaposes leisure with work, and we're back into that loop of thinking about leisure as a reward or a way to rejuvenate to get back to work. I think we can probably fix this someday to talk about leisure, a right in and of itself, just for leisure, not to prepare to go back to work, but just in and of itself, its own experience. So that's leisure in a nutshell, and that's a way of thinking about it in a quite a complex way, I think. And I hope maybe there's something there that's new for you. And if you reflect on your activities that you listed at the beginning, perhaps you can see meaning and self-determination in there. I hope you can, because I think that's a sign of a well-lived life. The other complicated term that I've brought into this discussion today is this notion of well-being. And to think about well-being, I'm drawing heavily on the Canadian Index of Well-being. If you haven't heard of it, I recommend that you check it out. The Index of Well-being is actually housed in my department at the University of Waterloo. The director is Dr. Brian Smale. And the index comes from about 20 years of scholars from around the world trying to figure out how to measure this idea of well-being. It is about living standards. It is about education. It is about health, but it's also about so much more. And so these scholars came together and they decided after a few years of discussions and collaborations that well-being is actually measured using 8 dimensions: education, living standards, community vitality, healthy populations, democratic engagement, time use, environment, and of course, leisure and culture. And that's the one that I want to talk about today. So I'd encourage you to investigate that index. It's a really fascinating way of trying to get at this complicated idea of well-being. So measuring leisure and culture, that one dimension of well-being, has 4 components. So following the CIW, the Canadian Index of Well-being, the leisure and culture domain has 4 main components. The first is participation in leisure, recreation, arts, and cultural activities. The second is perceptions, feelings about leisure activities, including why people participate, what needs are being met through that participation, and how leisure and culture participation benefits those people. The third is the experience of leisure, or the meaning that it holds for people in relation to the quality of life. The final component includes the provision of leisure and culture opportunities, such as access to recreation facilities, open spaces and parks, and other arts, culture, and recreation sites. Taken together, these components are used to define, measure, and understand leisure and culture, and to explore its relationship to the broader idea of well-being. On the other side of the screen here is a report, Run, Don't Walk. There is a report out about well-being in rural Ontario. It was a collaboration between the Canadian Index of Wellbeing and the Rural Ontario Institute. It's available, free to download. It's a fascinating document. I'll just draw your attention to how leisure and culture measured up. So from the 2020 report, A Profile of Wellbeing in Rural Ontario regarding leisure and culture, that domain, when compared to their urban counterparts, slightly more rural residents devoted a higher percentage of their daily time to leisure activities and to arts and cultural activities. And they were much more likely to take advantage of programs offered by places like their local libraries. They did, however, spend fewer nights away on vacation on average than residents of metro areas. So less traveling, but more active community engagement in leisure and recreation activities. So I'd invite you to take a look at that report and to see those details, and details as well around the other dimensions of the Wellbeing Index. So just for a few minutes, I want to kind of make these ideas come alive a little bit and share with you some ongoing research that I've had for the last couple of decades. So we're going to take leisure seriously for well-being by looking at curling clubs. Now, I have to confess, and I've said this to a few people now, if you think eyes roll when you tell them that you're a professor of leisure studies, imagine the reaction you get when you tell them that you spend a lot of your time investigating curling clubs. I get all sorts of reactions to that. And again, it's part of my kind of agenda today to, if you don't understand or you've never been in one of these places, I want to just open the door a little bit and show you how they can be used to illustrate the importance of leisure in people's lives. They're not perfect places, I'm not defending them, but I do think they're more interesting and they can be taken more seriously than they have been. And you can think along those lines of the way leisure and culture is measured by the index, participation, perceptions, experiences, and opportunities. About 1 million people curl regularly in this country, and that's more than 10 times a year. A lot of people curl more than that, and some people curl less, but that's a pretty typical statistic. There are about 1,500 curling clubs across this country, and about 30% of them have fewer than 200 members. So they're in small places and they're small clubs, and they are, I think, over time, I've learned that they are pretty important places, especially in rural communities. So just briefly, I'll show you some of the projects that I've been involved with since about 2005. One was an ethnographic project. Ethnography is a deep dive into the culture of a place. A lot of good ethnography work comes out of our field in leisure studies. You can really understand the culture of leisure activities. So I did a 5-year project traveling across the country, 25 clubs, 600 hours of interviews and observations, met over 1,000 curlers, and got a sense of the role that the club played in their community and in their lives. That led to a photo voice project. It's a fascinating methodology. Basically, instead of, as well as doing interviews with participants, you hand them cameras and you say, tell me about, in this case, the role of the curling club in your health and well-being, and take a picture to convey that for me. And so participants came back with photos, and then we had these amazing focus groups talking about the role of the club in their lives. I'll show you some of those photos in a few minutes. 7 clubs, 52 participants, women and girls, at 900 photos. And then now I'm in the midst of a project with Dr. Fen Chang, who's another research chair for Gateway, where we're thinking about curling clubs as places where people feel generally comfortable to talk about what's going on in their lives. And we're using those spaces to think about talking about issues of health and well-being supports in rural areas. You might notice by the dates there that the pandemic managed to insert itself right in the middle of our project, so it hasn't quite gone as planned, but we are learning still a lot about the role of the clubs, the absence of the clubs in light of the pandemic in people's lives, and it's generating some really interesting insights. So I'll show you just a few outcomes from these projects. People curl in their communities because curling clubs are Important sources of regular physical and social activity. Definitely came out loud and clear that people used the opportunity to go and curl with their friends as sources of sustaining or maintaining their mental health. Of course, the winter months, the further up north you go, the less sunlight there is in the winter, and they became almost acute sources of meeting their mental health needs. And they were people spoke about them very carefully that way. They really acknowledged that it was a source of helping to maintain their mental health and well-being. It's also a source of physical activity, as you can see in these photos. There are opportunities for community engagement, most likely volunteering. A lot of work goes into maintaining these clubs, bake sales, fundraisers, bonspiel, curling events, dinners that often raise funds for the club. But there's also, it's not just an opportunity for volunteering. There's a lot of pride involved in being engaged in these clubs and helping them to succeed. So there's an outlet there for people to be actively engaged in their community. They're platforms for valued intergenerational family activity. I met families of 3 and 4 generations that were curling together. There aren't many sports you can say that about. You see lots of kids in curling clubs, you see a lot of older adults, and you see lots of family relationships that are there before you on the weekend in the club. Not a lot of places can say that, I think, in our leisure and elsewhere, where you can spend time with your great-grandmother curling. And I think one of the nicest way to think about curling clubs and other leisure spaces, curling clubs are the example here, as a third place for the community. And third place means not your home, not your work, but this third place, this other place that's deeply meaningful to you. And we're still, I think, trying to find language around expressing that, because we're so dominated by thinking about work that it's hard to articulate this, but we think about it as the third place for the community. And I'll finish just with a quick quotation from a participant. This was a club that in Hay River in Northwest Territories that had lost, there was a big snowfall and the roof was aging and it collapsed and they lost half of their curling capacity. And so while I was there, or while I was doing research there, they were kind of in a pretty dire situation. And they were trying to articulate to the community how important this place was, because the town wasn't ponying up to give them resources to rebuild. And so one of the participants, she was actually the president of the club, she said to me, "It's not just a club. We're doing the town a service by providing a sporting complex for the whole community, after school programs, wellness groups, seniors. It's not just a club, it's a service to the community." And I think we do well to start to think about leisure and recreation as health services. I think we would get better at rewarding them or creating space for them and financially supporting them if we realized really the role that they play in people's lives as a service. So I'll wrap up there. I want to just head back to where we started, to look again at your 3 activities and to consider whether they were interrupted by the pandemic. I'm imagining a lot of them were. How did you feel about that when you couldn't access those activities? What was the impact on your well-being? What does that say about the role of leisure in your life? And I think we always need to keep thinking about differential impact. We know that the pandemic affected people differently. We need to focus on the impact. We tend to focus on the impact of work and our financial situation. Very important considerations, of course, but I think there's also room to start thinking about what the impact was on our leisure, and as a result, what the impact then was on our mental health and well-being, on our social relationships, on our ability to maintain health in times of stress. So I'll leave you with that, and I will introduce my colleague, Carla, who will lead the next discussion. If I can find pardon me for one sec, there we go. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Karla. Karla Boluk is an associate professor in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies at Waterloo. Guided by a social justice paradigm and feminist ethics of care, Karla's work has 3 broad goals where she examines the role of tourism in enhancing the well-being and quality of life for those involved. Karla's work is also challenged and critiqued the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, as well as considered the global framework to understand how tourism can help build and progress the sustainability goals. So I welcome Karla, and she'll share a bit of her research with you now. Thanks.
Thanks, Heather. Do I have access to share my slides?
Yes, you should have a share screen button.
Got it. I see it now. Thank you. Can you see that?
Yeah, we see your PowerPoint now. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Heather, and thanks so much for having me on this panel today. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies, and I'm also the co-chair of Tourism Education Futures Initiative, which is referred to as TEFI in our field, whose sole mandate is to be future-focused and mutually inspire, inform, and support tourism researchers, educators, and those working in the sector to passionately and courageously transform the world for the better. And the role that I have with TEFI and the work we do is important, and it's an important backdrop, I think, for what I'll be talking about in the next few minutes. So pictured here is our last memory several of us had pre-COVID regarding tourism. This is when the headlines in popular culture and the literature was completely focused on over-tourism. The top left and the top right provide two different perspectives of the misery by residents in Barcelona. And the top middle picture is a picture of the Trevi Fountain in Rome. And the bottom two pictures, on the bottom left is Niagara Falls in Canada, and the bottom right is the Great Wall of China. Over-tourism is defined as too many people in the same place at the same time. It causes degradation, congestion, inflated rent prices, and it challenges our understanding of carrying capacity, which O'Reilly referred to in 1986. Carrying capacity is when the maximum population size may be sustained by the available resources. And my colleagues and I have been talking about arguing that over-tourism reveals our inability to care in tourism on behalf of all the stakeholders involved. What over-tourism helps us understand is that the economic opportunities that tourism has received, the longstanding attention that's received by governments and by businesses, it's been prioritized. So that the economic generation and the reference to tourism as an industry has been mainly focused on driving profit. And yet the sector contributes to so many different negative impacts, impacting people in a precarious workforce, communities with the destruction of heritage, and environments with increased pollution. And so our concerns with sustainability have led many scholars in tourism to make calls for new tourism models and new approaches, practices to support clear and sustainable practices and responsible tourism outcomes, which recenters human well-being. And it emphasizes or perhaps challenges stakeholders to demonstrate care within tourism, within our decision-making. And over the last 20 or so months, we've been living through this pandemic, the tourism literature has been saturated with suggestions that the halts in tourism should allow us to rethink and reset what tourism looks like and the way that we practice tourism, allowing us to reimagine what a more sustainable industry or sector and what that might look like. And while the idea of reimagining what tourism could look like offers some of us hope, it also takes a lot of work. And this is problematic given that a lot of governments and businesses operating within a capitalist system are really keen to rebound after this long pause in tourism. So I'm just going to share a little bit about my research trajectory. I carried out my PhD research in New Zealand at the University of Otago, and I was really interested in researching in the area of ethics. And I landed on a certification that took place in South Africa, or that was assigned to businesses in South Africa, called Fair Trade Tourism in South Africa. And fair trade tourism is focused on ensuring that employees have fair wages, there's fair working conditions, fair distribution of benefits, ethical business practice, and respect for cultures, human rights, and the environment. My empirical research during my time in South Africa focused on interviewing consumers about their knowledge of fair trade and the impacts that it has within the context of South Africa. and also producers, so entrepreneurs and managers who are running what I later understood to be social enterprises. These individuals running these social enterprises cared deeply about the social issues that existed within South Africa, specifically as a consequence of the apartheid system, which existed from 1948 to 1994. And so a lot of these social entrepreneurs were so concerned about the social issues that existed within the country, as well as some of the benefits that they received during the apartheid system for the white entrepreneurs that I interviewed, that they wanted to give back to the communities and to broader society. Many of the communities where these social enterprises were set up were in rural contexts. And the social entrepreneurs that I interviewed created business models that integrated their communities. And they recognized a level of sweat equity, so the efforts that were poured into the business from the broader community. And so communities shared partial ownership, and trusts were set up, and the communities focused on specific programming around education, health, nutrition, and effectively what these social entrepreneurs did with their social enterprises is they focused on a synergy between sustainability, rural development, and tourism. So social entrepreneurs are individuals who are catalysts for change. They're recognized as change agents, as disruptors, as creators who reframe challenges and implement a response in a way of a product or a service with the intention of providing a social need contributing to enhanced well-being within their communities. Importantly, social entrepreneurs respond to governmental deficiencies or inadequacies in the market. And also importantly is that social entrepreneurs have been responding to the Sustainable Development Goals long before they were even created. So the SDGs were implemented as a blueprint, as a framework in 2015, pushing on from the 8 Millennial Development Goals. And they represent, a framework for pursuing social, economic, and environmental sustainability. We recognize the Sustainable Development Goals as an important framework within the sector of tourism, specifically because I think a lot of us were motivated to think critically about the SDGs and the role of the tourism sector. Because in 2017, the United Nations recognized that year as the year for International Year of Sustainable Tourism Development. So tourism was positioned as a leader and as a sector leader, really, in the advancement of the SDGs. I've led 2 special issues and an edited book focused on tourism's role in advancing and also critiquing the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm working on a second edited book just now. One of the important insights from our 2019 editorial was drawing the importance of engaging in Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and feminist perspectives, which we argue are imperative for recognizing and realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. And one area that I've started to delve into is the notion of regenerative tourism. And this is a newer approach to understanding tourism. And it's based on the concept that tourism should be more than just sustainable. In fact, tourism should seek to improve places. And regenerative tourism should make tangible contributions and a positive impact in the communities in which it takes place. And tourism social entrepreneurs, in my view, are a useful stakeholder for exploring such impacts. My work has been influenced by Carol Gilligan, who was a philosopher and wrote this book right around the time I was born, entitled In a Different Voice. Gilligan's work noted that society has focused on the dominant of male experiences. And so her book chose to highlight in a different voice the perspectives of women. Gilligan reminds us of the ideal of care as an activity of relation, of seeing and responding to need, taking care of the world by sustaining the web of connection so that no one is left alone. I think emphasizing care is more important now than ever before, given some of the crises that we're living through, specifically with the environmental crises, social justice crises with our treatment of Indigenous peoples, both in the past and currently, the health crises with COVID-19, and the many inequities the pandemic has shone a light on. I have a visual here of an edited collection that some of our colleagues in Australia recently pulled together. It was recently published just a few weeks ago. It's available as a PDF online, and Heather and I have both contributed to it. And what I think is really interesting is that this philosopher Gilligan wrote in a different voice in 1982. And in 2021, this is the first compilation of women's voices, recognizing the unique contributions of female scholars within our field. In response to a request to contribute to an edited book on tourism impacts, I dove into the literature on tourism social entrepreneurs once again to recognize the impacts of these change agents within the field of tourism. And this was interesting for me because I have taken a couple of parental leaves over the last few years. And so I was reorienting myself with some of the literature on tourism social entrepreneurs. After attending to the literature kind of with a fresh set of eyes, our analysis revealed a number of gaps, which have significantly influenced my current work. We recognize that there's limited diversity on the role of tourism social entrepreneurs. Specifically, attending to the role of women tourism social entrepreneurs has been largely unexplored in the literature, as well as adopting a feminist ethics of care lens, which has only recently been signaled in the literature. And I've come to understand that ignoring the role of women tourism social entrepreneurs reflects the dominant, masculine, and economically informed understandings of what success looks like in the literature. Ignoring the role of women in the literature is juxtaposed with our understanding that women are recognized as essential change agents in their communities. They're generally more purpose-driven than men, more likely to initiate businesses with the intention of making a difference, and place a high importance on community well-being. Yet women face unique challenges and barriers, and these aren't fully recognized. Such insights are imperative to support a she recovery, that is a COVID-19 recovery that attends to the interests of women. This analysis of the current gaps in the literature led me to frame a provincial grant that I applied for in the spring, building on a national grant that I'm leading, that I'm currently leading. And I carried out a pilot study in this spring of exploring the roles of women tourism social entrepreneurs in progressing the Sustainable Development Goals, with the intention of understanding some of the gender barriers that they face and key facilitators to pursuing their sustainability activities in some of the rural contexts that are listed here. So Huron County, Prince Edward County, Manitoulin Island, and Muskoka. We are in the thick of analyzing our data just now, but I wanted to share a flavor of what was shared. All of the women that we interviewed, and we interviewed 16 women in the spring, shared gender barriers with us. The chefs operating restaurants were called very colorful names, especially when demonstrating any kind of ambition. The female mechanics working in bike shops, serving tourism bike routes, were also called names, and some customers refused to have their bikes repaired by women. We're learning governmental supports are different between genders, and there's limited supports and networks for female entrepreneurs. Many of our informants practice farm to fork, translating their values into the products they sell, as well as demonstrating reverence for the communities in which they live in, and demonstrating regenerative practices, so giving back to the communities in which their businesses operate. There's one direct quotation here of a woman who was reflecting on the possibility of what would happen to her business as a consequence of COVID. And then she mentioned that somebody gifted her a large sum of money to allow her to continue her business, and offered her this idea that she should just pay it forward. She didn't have to pay the money back. There were some examples of how our informants are taking care of their communities with the onset of the pandemic. And we also came to learn that some of these examples of how some of the communities are returning the care onto the individuals. And I think this is showcased here. One informant shared that she started making food for a marginalized or disadvantaged families within her community, serving over more than 200 disadvantaged children. And she did this out of her own pocket for 4 months. And when the broader community started to hear about this, she started to receive checks in the mail to ensure that this activity was going to be sustained, to cover some of the costs and injured from this activity. And then her bank found out about what she was working on and gifted her, through their thank you campaign, a brand new patio and furniture, which was worth over $30,000. Our preliminary analysis of our data reveals that our informants bridge their personal values with their business objectives. They recognize their purpose and their agency, and our informants are community advocates, and they play an important role in educating their communities towards regenerative futures, and consider their role as being good ancestors, emphasizing Indigenous wisdom and also reverence, not taking more than they need. We recognized that the women tourism social entrepreneurs that we interviewed are demonstrating positive self-efficacy, self-respect, recognizing themselves as an ambassador, a resource for their community, and an educator to their broader community. We recognize these women tourism social entrepreneurs as demonstrating care for their community, as they attended to the needs of marginalized groups, youth, their elders, and placing an emphasis on community well-being. We recognize that they are demonstrating care for the entire ecosystem, because there was some evidence of informal entrepreneurial support systems and also responses to systemic injustices. We recognize that our women tourism social entrepreneurs are providing education for care within their communities, recognizing agency and advocacy, and also supporting regenerative practices. And lastly, we recognize that our women tourism social entrepreneurs feel as though care is the mindset and it's a reflection of their values. So what I hope to do next with our data as I continue to work our way through the analyses is to demonstrate the ripple effects of care and how the care these women give is reflected back onto them as the wider ecosystem pays attention to their regenerative practices. So just to conclude, women tourism social entrepreneurs are enhancing the well-being and contributing to sustainable and regenerative futures within, not only within the communities that they're working in. And further analysis regarding the roles, the contributions, and the supports required by women tourism social entrepreneurs are very much needed, specifically in light of the pandemic, in order to support a she recovery, that is a recovery including women, given that women have been adversely affected by the pandemic. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carla. That was great. Brilliant work. Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce Chris Lee. Chris, as you heard when Dan introduced him, was on the board of the, Chris Lee was a former Gateway board member, and he's on the board of the directors for the Goderich to Guelph Rail Trail and the Regional Tourism Organization number 4. He's also past president of the Walton Raceway, an outdoor recreation park, which hosts the Edge of Walton, a not-for-profit challenge course. And I'll invite Chris to share his thoughts for a few minutes.
There we go. I'm here. Okay, well, I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of exactly what the Guelph to Goderich to Guelph Rail Trail is. It's unique in the province in that it's derived from a railway that was built in 1908 and acquired by Canadian Pacific, and they decommissioned it in the late 80s. So it had an 80-year life as a railway servicing that corridor from Goderich to Guelph. When the province or when the CP decommissioned it, the province saw it as an opportunity to seize to acquire the whole right of way, maintain the integrity of the right of way. So in anticipation of putting a water pipeline in to pump drinking water from Lake Huron to Guelph. Shortly after they acquired it, the Great Lakes Water Treaty came into effect, and that put the kibosh on it, because if you couldn't take water from one watershed and release it into another, because Guelph basically flushes their toilets into the Grand River, so which goes to Lake Erie. So the province was sitting on the asset and sort of looked about and decided to maintain ownership and designate it as recreational for walking, hiking, that type of thing, and specifically non-motorized. Unfortunately, they, while the trail bed, the integrity was maintained, all the hardware was sold off for scrap, anything that was steel, and the only exception to that being the final bridge in Goderich, where a group of citizens got together, rallied around a fundraising campaign, and literally put a check in the bank while the salvage crews were partway between Hamilton and Goderich to take the bridge down. So the GGG in its current state consists of the trail bed and so the province did lease out some sections of it, and there was sort of a model for operating as a trail from Millbank to Guelph and from Maitland River back to Goderich. There's sections to trail organizations there, but the section in between, roughly a third of it, was sort of in disrepair, being maintained by people driving on it with ATVs, basically. The people that I was attracted to the idea that we could stitch all these pieces together, that we basically had an asset sitting there waiting to be polished up. And that was about 10 years ago. And so we eventually did float to the province the idea that, in fact, they should, lease the bulk of the trail out to us as the G2G. And we kicked around various ways of doing that for a number of years. And finally, the province got, I think, frustrated with our inability to coordinate with municipalities. And suddenly wrote us a lease for everything that wasn't already leased. So we were suddenly acquired the right to manage 132 kilometers of trail without any capacity to do so. So we've spent the last 5 years finding ways to bring that about. And so that's sort of in a nutshell what we had there was 2/3 of the trail or half the trail in a good state of repair, being used sort of under the auspices of trail groups at each end. And then that sort of long stretch in between that varied from barely usable to brambles up to your ears kind of thing at certain times of the season. So in the last few years, and last year in particular, we finally were able to complete all the clearing and the grading and resurface the whole thing with stone dust. It was quite an undertaking, amazing to hit the end of August with the whole thing completed. And the effect has been revolutionary as to how the trail gets used, the volume of use and the type of users. And I think, from the standpoint of the topic today, it's been an interesting journey for me. I'm rural. I live out in the middle of northern Huron county. I'm a farmer, ex-farmer, entrepreneur type of thing, and I have to say, yeah, I'm one of the guys that would eye roll at Heather a drop of a hat. If she suggested studying leisure. I mean, as a self-employed entrepreneur, you almost anytime you took time off was with a sense of guilt. So it's kind of a turnaround to be involved in a project like this and to see how people are using it. So my original sense of how the trail would be used varied. I had a couple of friends that walked it end to end 5 years ago and wrote a book about it. I had other friends that were hardcore cyclists, and the spandex and the drop bars and the whole deal. And I kind of visualized something at that level, that kind of hardcore dedication to cycling and traveling and so on. In actual fact, what's been astonishing in the last 12 months is just to go out on the trail, and I now spend a lot of time out there because I go there with the excuse that I'm maintaining it and somebody has to keep an eye on things. So I get out there 3 or 4 times a week, but invariably I pass my neighbors, walking with their dad who's having issues, trouble getting out of the house himself. They drive him down there, take him for a walk. I'm just thinking even this week what I passed, was a dad with 2 little kids, 8, 10-year-olds with 10-inch wheels, and they're like kilometers from anywhere in the middle of a swamp, but it's a safe place to do that. Another mom with a couple of babies in a cart, and yes, there's groups of people coming through that are got bags and they're making passage from Goderich to Guelph and camping out and that sort of thing. But it's amazing the way the completion of the trail has completely changed the nature of the users. And I would attribute that to a number of things. Obviously, creating a safe place for people to recreate or to participate in leisure activities, whatever they may be, was really important, and much more important than you realize. And if you really start to think about it, there are relatively few places, safe places, to go if you're on a walk or have limited mobility or even emotional issues. If your disabilities can be mental ones, or emotional ones, this is a safe, quiet place to go to deal with those or to remediate those sort of things. So it really has been amazing to see that mixture of users. And the other interesting, I'm kind of doing the opposite to what all the academics are doing. I'm very about the observational part here. So my observation is that the trail is tolerating an interesting mix and volume of users. Even the most crowded parts of the trail, at the nether ends at say Elmira and Kitchener, Waterloo ends, never looks like it's stressed. And in part because people recognize there is that mixture of use. And the other is that you always have clear lines of sight because there's no hills and there's some bends, but they're moderate. And because it's cleared back and you're basically walking either through an open space or an open tunnel, you can see who's coming all the time. And so it creates safety in every regard. It means that person that's doing end to end with his gravel bike and he's going to do it in 14 hours can intermingle with that dad with the 2 little kids, 2 8-year-olds, safely and happily. Neither of them seem to feel threatened by the other, and that's a very unusual and unexpected sort of piece that I see going on out there. The other is that a trail like that, because it was originally constructed just in a direct line, it isn't running. It gives you a unique perspective on on what should normally is a familiar landscape. I mean, we've all driven from Elmira to Goderich in chunks or in some form, but you get an entirely different perspective when you go through backcountry. And, you know, at times you kind of question if you really know where you are, because there's no houses in sight, there's no nothing. You know, the original engineers and surveyors did a brilliant job of creating this dead flat, you know, straight path through all these rolling hills. And while we built roads in straight lines, they sort of went where they had to go. So it has value in that it passes through wetlands, it passes through ecosystems, down the Maitland Valley, across the Grand Valley, or I'm sorry, the Grand River and the Conestoga rivers. So you have a really wonderful opportunity if you're a naturalist, if you're a birder, all of those types of people are showing up out there to appreciate it. You know, there's lots of wetlands that this trail passes through that nobody would ever have thought of walking through the middle of. But again, here's a safe, dry path that my 92-year-old mother with a walker can go through. She wouldn't have gone there when she was healthy, let alone when she's 92. But the trail has created the opportunity for her to go places she couldn't have otherwise gone. Birders like it because the trail is elevated, and so, you know, birds go in stratas up the tree. There's certain varieties of birds exist in the tree tops, and others exist in the shrubbery. And, you know, walking along 20 or 30 feet off the ground is a unique opportunity to be right literally in amongst a group of birds that you normally study from a distance. So some really unique perspectives, unique opportunities that occur with the trail, and it's attracting all these people. And again, they seem to be able to intermingle happily, you know, without conflict. And when we have sections that were of the what was previously the unimproved parts of the trail, where our trail counters are picking up 50 to 75 passages a day, on sections where 2 years ago it would have counted the occasional ATV, and that would have been about it. So we're seeing the substantial escalation of volume of traffic, diversity of use, and I think it's a real tribute to you know, the need, the demand, and what happens if you create this kind of safe space, and you know, a place for people to you know, indulge in these leisure activities. Incidentally, I should add, and I was going to say the other thing is that surprised me is actually the diversity of how people, you know, I mean, they walk it and they bike it, but the bikes can be tandem bikes, side-by-sides, recumbents, and a huge impact is being felt from the emergence of e-bikes. Because again, the e-bike makes it possible for people with limitations in terms of mobility to experience large lengths of the chunks of the trail. They wouldn't normally have gone out even on the trail on a bicycle. And I've run across, you know, whole groups of, I'm just thinking of one I ran across. There was like 8 or 10 folks older than myself on e-bikes, had driven down from Kincardine and had gone all the way from Goderich down the Maitland River, and they were just blown away. You know, they had no idea that was there. E-bikes made it possible for them to experience all of that. So that's a revolution going on in terms of leisure activities that didn't really, you know, was a minor player just a few years ago. You know, we've gone as far as having, when I talk about the mobility issues, we've had people go end to end with scooters, mobility scooters. You know, they do it a chunk at a time, and the bus picks them up and sort of leapfrogs them down the trail from day to day. We've had people with quadriplegic that have done it end-to-end, doing the same thing. And the whole concept of doing end-to-end is an interesting piece in itself, in that, as I say, 7 or 8 years ago, it was such a thing that, you know, Linda Wilson wrote a book about it. Now it's almost a daily occurrence. Again, when I'm out on the trail, I can almost pick them out. And I mean, one guy just ran by here just in the last 24 hours. He did it straight through from, you know, just kept running. Did it in, I think it took him 30 hours or something. He ran all night, just kept going. The fastest one we had did it in 14 hours. That was smoking, but anyway. So the end-to-end possibility has created a whole sort of body of interest in itself, and again, those end-to-ends are all over the place in terms of mobility and what they want to achieve.
I think Chris, we're gonna have to
cut me off.
Jump in here and call it. Yeah. So first of all, Jay, I want to apologize to you for not getting time in. So I'm looking forward to when you have your own lecture.
That's
and
quite all right.
We'll schedule you for the winter. So first of all, I would just like to say thank you to Heather for putting the panel and the topics together. It's been very interesting, insightful, and very important discussion with a rich smorgasbord of ideas, research, and leisure activity and other endeavors from many perspectives. So what we're finding with these is you just want to keep going or have another one. So I'm hoping that you will all consider perhaps coming back at another time and we can continue this discussion. So thanks, Heather, for creating this conversation and linking up research with leisure. I want to take the opportunity now to thank our sponsors, Bruce Power, Larry Otten Contracting, Ian Murray of CIBC Wealth Management, DeJager Town Square IDA Pharmacy, and the town of Goderich. Without their support, excuse me, this lecture series would not be possible. Gateway Center of Excellence in Rural Health is a not-for-profit organization with charitable status. We greatly appreciate and welcome the support we receive. If you'd like to be a donor or a sponsor at Gateway, we'd be pleased to talk to you about opportunities therein. Lastly, thank you again to all the attendees who joined us today. We look forward to welcoming you to the next lecture series event on November 2nd, and our speaker will be Scott Brown, a graduate student at the University of Guelph and a research associate at Gateway. I hope you'll all pass this information along to your networks so we can expand the reach of this lecture series. Our aim is to promote the knowledge economy, reduce social isolation, and support Gateway's mission of improving the health and quality of life of rural residents. With that, I'll say thank you and goodbye.